Call the meeting to order. Thank you. Clerk will take a silent roll call. First, I want to mention, apologize to the public in the sense that the agenda wasn't posted as quickly as what it should have been. We had some technical glitches, but now the agenda will be posted on the Joint Legislative Oversight Commission on State Water Resources in the future. So it'll be easier. There's a website specifically for water resources where we have all testimonies there, both the video as well as any minutes, any documentation we receive, we also post there, and the agenda will be posted there as well, but I apologize for that delay. I didn't know until this morning that the agenda wasn't posted. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And first I would ask Mr. Rich Ireland of the Rosemount Tank Gauging to come forward for his presentation. Mr. Ireland, thanks for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, first, thank you for having me. I'd like to thank the committee, first of all, for allowing me to speak. My name is Rich Ireland. I live in Mink Shoals, West Virginia, just a couple miles upriver from the tanks at Freedom Industries. I ride my bike by there all the time and smell the licorice. I don't know how many times. My family was personally affected by this chemical release. I happen to work for Emerson Process Management. We're a USA-based company that designs and manufactures measuring instruments, sensors, and controls. We're one of the largest in the world. We're a $25 billion company. But my particular position at Emerson is a sales manager for the tank gauging business. My territory covers Eastern North America. So I'm going to work extensively with above ground storage tanks and the customers. And all my customers are AST owners and operators, mostly in the petroleum industry, I might say. So the Rosemount Tank Gauging business unit focuses on high accuracy measurement of the properties of bulk liquid. The primary use of tank gauging systems has always been for inventory control, but in more recent years, automatic tank gauging systems have become an integral part of environmental safety for overfill and leak detection in the bulk storage industry. So I'm here today to inform the committee of a lot of work that's going on in other bodies like the American Petroleum Institute. We're very involved in that. API committees are made up of a combination of regulators, equipment manufacturers, and operators of the equipment. They meet on a regular basis to determine how often standards need to be updated, and they recommend operational practices for petroleum industries worldwide. It's a worldwide standard, even though it's called the American Petroleum Institute. Delegates from my company sit on many of the working committees at API. One of the most recent and applicable standards I want to discuss is the API 2350, which is an overfill standard, comprehensive. Until recently, it was a recommended practice, but recent incidents worldwide have pushed the importance of comprehensive overfill protection, and API 2350 Edition 4 became a standard at the end of 2012. API 2350, as written, is only applicable to above-ground storage tanks with petroleum products. It's a petroleum standard. But there's no reason why these recommendations that come out of this committee, of the API committee, and that standard could be developed, part of them as a part of a comprehensive solution here in the state of West Virginia. We'd be the first state to adopt API 2350 recommendations as regulation. The API committee worked hard to make sure the standard was not a simple prescriptive standard. It requires extensive pre-work by the tank operator to determine the risk of their storage based on several key factors. I would venture to say that the tanks at Freedom Industries, sitting merely meters away from the drinking water supply, would have pushed these tanks to the highest level of risk category. Another key feature of API 2350 is that once risk level is determined, the standard becomes more prescriptive by assigning necessary categories of protection that are required for that tank, ranging from 1 to 4. Category 3 is most applicable. We'll see that mostly. Category 4 being employed in the most high-risk cases. But it's important that overfill is just one of the points of a good environmental leak and overfill strategy, environmental protection strategy for above ground storage tanks. It's just as important, as we all know from this incident, that standards like API 653, those tanks, by the way, were built to a standard called API 650. Those were petroleum tanks repurposed. And API 653 would have required them to go through a periodic inspection, emptying and a qualified third-party inspector to go in and inspect these tanks on a regular basis. I say that we have something like that in any kind of regulation that comes out of this committee. That part of it is overfill, leak detection, and mechanical integrity monitoring, and also secondary containment monitoring. So those things are needed to complete the circle. And we could be the first state to adopt this kind of a comprehensive approach using what has been learned through the majority of the bulk liquid tanks are in the petroleum industry. They know how to store liquids. I mean, there's liquids stored along the Kanawha River very responsibly by petroleum companies all the time. So that's what I wanted to try to instill into the committee, that we go through a comprehensive approach that's not just leak detection. It should be overfill protection. It should be also mechanical inspection on a regular basis and risk assessment. Thank you.
Questions by members? Senator Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your report, too. We're sorry we didn't get you the last time.
That's okay. Yeah, it's fine.
I'm just curious the cost of this type of approach.
There are several layers that you don't need to go overboard with overfill protection. It can be as simple as nowadays the technology is very reliable and frankly not as expensive as it used to be. We have some very elaborate equipment that can be several $1,000s. That's overkill in these kind of situations. But for simple overfill protection, it could be less than $1,000 a tank to put a high-level switch on there. The more important thing is doing the risk evaluation. If it is a high-risk tank, maybe it does deserve the fact that you have an inventory monitoring system on the tank. But yeah, there's several manufacturers out there that manufacture this kind of equipment. We just feel that once that is known to the operator that they have to have some kind of overfill, they can make an evaluation on their capital expense, what they want to do. There's other benefits to having level monitoring the tank for their internal operations.
Well, I guess I'm curious about the evaluation, what it would cost.
Yeah, it can be as little as $1,000 a tank. I mean, it's not a huge deal. It's a matter of the more expensive thing is going through the risk analysis and determining their risk level and also leak detection. Leak detection systems are usually put into the ground. We don't do too much in that arena, but that's a very important part of the equation. And then tank inspections, obviously. It costs money to store. If you want to store liquid near water supply, you've got to pay the piper, All
right, thank you.
right, thank you.
Other questions by members? Co-Chair Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, you did touch base on something that I'm very interested in, and that's the leak detection equipment.
Yes.
You indicated that most generally it's an in-ground leak detection.
Yes.
Is there any in-tank leak detection equipment, and what would the cost parameters be for that per tank?
Yes. When you're doing it in tank, you're actually monitoring the bulk inventory level. We do that, and we're probably the BMW of the industry, so the cost associated with it. In order to see small movements, and you remember these are large diameter tanks, so very small amounts. 1 millimeter of movement in a 40-foot or 80-foot diameter tank could be, I don't know how many gallons of liquid, so it might be, in order to do that, you have to have very high accuracy measure. We use radar, and we get down to a half millimeter measurement, but a system like that's pretty costly and probably overkill in the sense of what you're trying to achieve for basic leak detection. So it's probably better to do in situ, put it in the ground, or put it in the secondary containment. If you have good secondary containment standards that are, and you really rigorously inspect the secondary containment, you can be assured that the tank's not leaking out of the secondary containment. Then you can have pretty inexpensive leak detection in the secondary containment that just watches for liquids in the secondary containment dikes.
Well, in the event that we would want to have a redundant system and have in-tank as well as secondary containment leak detection.
Yes.
What would the cost be, or what would the cost range be for different types of leak detection for in-tank? Because
Yeah.
a lot of these facilities are already existing, we're not going to be able to put in-ground leak detection probably in a lot of them because
Sure.
of the way they're already.
Well, like like an above-ground storage tank with temperature compensated direct monitoring leak, tank gauge with leak detect capabilities is probably going to be $15,000 per tank. And then, versus a switch inside of a dike system, which might be $1,000, just to monitor presence of something in the dike. There are hydrocarbon type detectors out there, and that's the fuel industry. You have to have something that's pretty liquid agnostic. It just has to look at any liquid that's in the secondary containment should be, in this case, because you're trying to write a broad standard for all kinds of liquids. So.
Are there any other types of leak detection equipment rather than just the high-end mark, which would be your BMW?
In-tank leak detection?
Yeah, like you said.
Yeah, not really.
With the radar, like laser or...
No, I mean, radar and laser, but radar is basically the laser for inside the tank. I mean, it's the highest capability you can get, and in order for it to be accurate, it costs bucks. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We're talking 15 grand.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Further questions? Mr. Ireland, you had made a statement, I would venture to say that the tanks at Freedom, sitting mere meters away from the drinking water supply, would push these tanks to the highest level of risk category.
Yes.
And I understand the logic of that, but what, in the risk category, the fact that it pushes there, what does that mean in regards to your presentation? Additional protections, or what are you suggesting that this would push to a higher risk category, and what's the response to that?
Yeah, so I would say that if you were going to write a regulation for above ground storage tanks that are near drinking water supply, first thing you have to look at is what's being stored. If it's obviously if it's under hazmat regulations, it's a whole different ballgame. It already has the highest risk associated with it. And then looking at, the potential damage and threat to environment and life. What the API 2350 would do is it would push you to something called an automatic overfill protection system. At the highest category, it would make you, it would be belt and suspenders. It's like, okay, well, you got this, you got to have the belt and the suspenders. You've got to put the overfill protection system on that has automatic shut off if there's any kind of problem. And now, of course, these standards are written for terminals that are taking in receipts. Barges are pulling up, so there's a lot of product movement, and that just adds to the risk of overfill and spill. Okay, so if there's a lot of product movement, that's also part of your risk assessment. If they're constantly taking barges in off the river, doing a lot of inventories and filling cycles, every time you move product, you're introducing new risk. Anytime hoses are being connected and valves are being opened, you're introducing risk to spill. So those all factor into the risk assessment. So
Now, the Freedom industry, the tanks there are used, you mentioned, and I've read that it was used for petroleum. Do you know if there's been any, did they retrofit anything or do anything to those
it appears to me that
prior to putting other type chemicals in it?
the only thing I could probably surmise, if you look at the tanks, a couple of them they're vented along the top, which meant that they probably had an internal floating roof, like a lot of petroleum tanks do. They have a roof that floats inside. They probably removed that for the product that they had, because it's a high maintenance item if you don't need it. And it also, I always smelled licorice every time I went by the place, so it would mean that the vapor was just coming off the product. Floating roof tends to stop that effect. Yeah, those are repurposed tanks. I mean, usually when you have gasoline and stuff in a tank, you put the floating roof in there to keep the vapor space to zero as close as possible.
But are petroleum tanks designed in such a way that it could hold all kinds of chemicals, or is originally it's of course designed to hold petroleum? But
Yes.
is there variations of tanks? If you're going to hold petroleum, you have a certain type of tank, but if you're holding other type of chemicals,
It's very specific, yes. API 650 is like, this is the standard to build a tank to hold gasoline and petroleum products.
Okay.
Now, there's been variations because ethanol has been added to gasoline and a lot of these other things, and you have to do certain, ethanol is not very friendly to carbon steel, so you have to do some things to change the, coat the tanks and, or do reformulation of your, or reinspection more frequently of your tank because of the ethanol factor, but yes, they are specifically designed.
So if a company owns petroleum tanks and they just decide, okay, we're no longer going to fill it with petroleum, but we want to fill it with another chemical, is there a process in which they have to go before DEP or send in saying, look, we're no longer going to use this facility for this purpose, we're going to use it for another, and then there's inspection, or is there approval, or is that just, you could, basically, if you have a tank, you can fill it up whatever you want?
I don't know that procedure, but I can tell you that if I was the responsible tank owner, I would be like worried about, I've got a carbon steel tank, what can I put in this thing that, it's not gonna rot through, and corrode through in a few years. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, that part of it, but I don't know what regulations exist to push them to look. There are coatings, there's a tank coating companies out there that do all kinds of specialty coatings to put different stuff in carbon steel tanks. Obviously they're gonna make the tank out of carbon steel most of the time because it's low cost to make, but then you coat it with something so it can hold it. But other than that, these look to me, just from the pictures I saw, look like they were just carbon steel tanks that they threw the liquid in. Just put it in there.
Thank you. Senator Walters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking through the pamphlet you handed out with us, and you all have what seems to be a type of an alarm system that if there's a leak, and it
Yes.
goes to a central computer system as well.
Yes.
So have you all set it up where it could do automatic reporting, that if a leak is done, not only does it go to
Oh,
the
yeah.
owner, but it can go to the DEP as well?
Well, no, we don't, that's typically not done that way, but, and nothing says that it couldn't if the requirement was there. It's just typically, the DEP or the local authority says, you need to report an overfill. It doesn't mean, we report the overfill for them, but.
Sure. No, I appreciate you saying the overfill, but also, is that typical in your leak detection as well? It does the same thing?
Yeah, leak detection is just, usually it's an operator alarm. Because the leak the leak may not be a real leak. It means that it left the tank, but they could have had a valve cracked open and it could have gone into some of the piping. It may not have gone into the ground. It just, you're typically dealing with a very dynamic terminal situation where fluids are being moved around inside of a refinery tank farm or a marketing tank farm, and they might just have a leak that's dripping into the piping or going into another tank, not going into the ground. But it's nice for them to know that, so they can go check.
Absolutely. Going back to one thing that you said that from your understanding of these tanks, they didn't have that coating on the inside to be allowed to.
I saw pictures and it looked like pretty raw, steel. Looked like,
So
yeah.
to you, it looked like it just corroded through because the chemical they put in could corrode through.
I think
carbon steel, right?
I think that if you don't inspect a carbon steel tank, I think it would corrode anyway, just from the water and moisture, and you got to take care of your equipment. I don't know what the term. API has designated turnaround times for tanks, and I think it's like 10 years or something for.
Is there a life expectancy on these tanks that it should be recoated by a certain time that you're aware of, or?
Well, there's no coatings in general, so, but, I have customers that are operating tanks that are 70 years old, just fine, because they do a proper maintenance and turnaround and repair as needed. There's several times when they go in and take tanks down and put new bottoms in. They do require patching. There's no doubt about it. Tanks are just, they're a big reservoir of metal, and you get in there and when they take them down for an API 653, or they call it a turnaround, an API turnaround, that's when it's time for them. They go in there and do a lot of, if they're going to modernize their tank gauging system, that's usually when they do it. So it's very opportune for us to know when these are taking place. and they go in there and check them out. They do pinhole. We've got people that run around with these little magnetic sensors look for pinholes in the floor and around the seams. And it's interesting, you know, West Virginia, we have a couple of, I happen to be living here as a tank, you know, in the tank industry. And there's a guy up in St. Mary's that he's like probably one of the most well-known tank inspectors in the whole country. It's funny that we base out of West Virginia, but and I've talked to him on several occasions about tank inspection, and it's a very thorough process. They go in metallurgy.
Sure. In the Senate bill, from my understanding, we have a requirement that an engineer does a test annually. But what you're telling me is that just being broad and stating an engineer might not be exactly the right term, but we should have, is there a certain class
Yes.
that has certain qualifications that we needed to make that more
Yes, you have to be a certified API tank inspector.
certified API tank inspector should be
Yes.
the language we should use?
Well, I don't know. I think you need to examine whether that covers, you might want to consult with the Chemical Safety Board, somebody that's doing a little more of a broader view. They use, like I was listening to that hearing the other day, and the fellow that was sitting there that was the investigator, he's an API 653 certified tank inspector, he even said it. And he's going through an API 653 with these tanks right now, so he's doing the process just as found evaluation.
And that goes beyond petroleum, correct?
Yeah. Well,
API, is that just a class to study tanks that deal with petroleum, or?
Technically, yes.
Okay, so that deals with petroleum. So I assume that there would be other specialties for other types of tanks.
Yeah, because they don't fall under API. American Petroleum Institute only has so
Okay,
much.
so API is American Petroleum Institute.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that helps.
Yeah, yeah. So the purview, but they are the majority. 90% of those large tanks in the world are petroleum tanks.
Sure.
And you can also find that people will build to API standards, even though they're going to store chemical in the tank. They build to the standard and then they coat the tank. And there's probably some other standard that covers that chemical industry. So that's what there's a little bit of work to be done on how I think there's a lot of good stuff that API does that's applicable, like the tank inspection programs.
But so from what you're saying, in the bill, essentially, we should say, if it is a petroleum tank, then it should be inspected by an API certified
Yes.
engineer, I guess.
Certainly, but I think that the point is, if it's going to be something we write as a state, maybe we can learn a little bit more about what, can we use, can the API 653 cover all of our needs? And, you may not, and that's because it is a good established training class and standard, maybe we can adopt that for all tanks, but that may be too broad. I don't know. I'm really anxious to see what Chemical Safety Board comes out. In fact, the consultant that works with us, the fellow that's at the back of that API guideline that I gave you, he's working on this investigation. He wasn't able to comment this time, but he works for us also as a consultant. But these are going to come out. This stuff will come out, I think, in this Chemical Safety Board.
They said within the year.
Yeah,
They
I
said
know
take about a year.
That's a long time, but
Yes, sir.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right,
I
thanks.
appreciate your answers.
Thank you. Further questions by members?
One more question.
I'm sorry, Mr. Allen.
One more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Questions for you.
Oh, good. No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I was a little late. Too late session, too many meetings at one time. In your estimation, how many, if we put the language that the Senator from Kanawha is referring to into that bill, how many people would qualify in West Virginia to be qualified to inspect these tanks?
I would imagine there's more than you think. I would think that Marathon Petroleum would have a few tank inspectors that are qualified. Most of the petroleum companies operate with their own inspectors they are inside, qualified to do their own internal inspection. But they also, there's several companies worldwide that do third party. A lot of people want a third party inspector to come in.
And currently, I believe the only tanks that we inspect, and that's only every 5 years, are like water tanks at
Yeah.
PSDs and et cetera.
Yeah, I don't really know much about outside the petroleum industry, what the
Okay.
requirements are.
Okay.
I just want to let you know.
I won't ask my next question. Thank you.
Okay, further questions? Thank you, Mr. Ireland.